I think the role of art direction in film is best understood as a big coloring book. You know, you're coloring in, you're enhancing, you're working necessarily in a collaborative art form to essentially do what we've all done, tell stories. The powerful thing about film, of course, is it's visual, and visual, I think, it gives a direct connection to how we think and how we judge the world and how we understand the world. So it's very, very powerful that we tell stories visually, I think. Even the oral tradition of ancient man, you know, there was a person there expressing and having expressions and changing their voice as they told the story. And that's very, very similar to what you can do in film, except you can also add the actual picturing. The cave paintings actually come to life, and you see the whole thing visually. So in a way, it's a great confirmation of our fundamental natural sanity. When I got out of the Army and back from Vietnam, I realized at that point I'd have to get a job and do something, and this was before I was doing the cartoons, which was hardly a job because I never made a living with the cartoons. But I decided that I would try to make a living as an artist, even though I didn't have a lot of training. So I gathered every painting, every sketch, everything I could put together, and through a friend, got a little exhibit in the lobby of a cinema, a Laemmle Cinema in LA, which is kind of an art house cinema. And so I had these very strange paintings and drawings and some early cartoons I did in the Army, all presented down the wall of this rather long lobby. And one of the things that happened was I got a call from John Milius, and he said that he wanted to commission a painting from me if I would do that. And I said, fine. So we hit it off enormously because we were both history buffs and such. And so in the course of doing that painting for him, which took a long time, I was doing other things. It all happened that way, and that was before I met Dan O'Bannon and worked on Dark Star. I came in with the Brat Pack, you know, with Francis Coppola's little gang of young filmmakers, Spielberg, Scorsese, Milius, and Lucas, and all. And so all of them were trying to change things, you know. So I got a very sympathetic ear if I wanted to suggest a new way to shoot something or come up with a new look for something. And working with all the kind of new wave Brat Pack movie makers, they were always open to new ideas, almost all of them, you know. So, and John was just one of the Brat Pack, you know, and just said, hell with tradition, you know. You're production designer. I want you to determine the look of Conan later when we did Conan. I think the construction phase is really intoxicating. It's fabulous. I mean, when we built that temple on the mountain in Spain, none of that's fake. We built that thing. It's almost 200 feet high, up the side of a mountain with these steps, and 1,500 people in robes, and James Earl Jones, you know, the villain. And, you know, and you're sitting there and you're at the end of the valley and you can hear James' voice echoing across the valley with all these people. That's a kick. That's really a kick, this giant temple. And then we also shot at night with thousands of torches, and the entire temple on the side of the mountain with these processions of thousands of torches going up the mountain. It was visible from a major highway. So people driving through Spain at night looked up and saw this enormous, looked like a Ku Klux Klan rally on the side of the mountain, you know. And there were cars parked for miles along the highway. Well, people were trying to figure out what it was, you know. Fabulous. I read the script. I have a lot of little suggestions on maybe changing the jargon to make it a little more believable and all that. And I have visions of the sets. And I'll go in and I'll talk to the director, and the director, of course, will usually have a vision as well. And we'll talk about it. He says, I suggest this, suggest that. Why don't we do it this way? And as I start doing serious drawings, I usually do plans and elevation because I like to control the space right away and make sure that they'll fit on stages. And the director walks around, looks at the drawings and says, puts in suggestions and things, and it just builds and builds. The construction starts finishing, and then I'm very keen on finishing sets with the proper colors and all with the ideas, and I have to discuss with the director. And it's pretty harrowing. You're on the production all the way. You're doing night shoots and day shoots, and you're trying to keep ahead of the shooting. And next thing you know, it's in the cinemas, or you're invited to a showing, and you see how it all comes together. It was fabulous. By and large, I was already a little bit typecast because then Dark Star was a goofy sci-fi send-up, and Star Wars, of course, was Star Wars. And John took on Conan, so then I got a chance to do an ancient world film, which I always wanted to do. And out of nowhere, Dan, of course, wrote Alien, and I helped him by doing some paintings that he could present with the script. And it was going all around town until Fox bought it. And once that happened, Dan he came to London on as the writer, he and Ron Shusett, and they strongly suggested that I be involved in the look of Alien. I suggested the opening where you do a Steadicam movement through the entire deserted ship. And Ridley liked that, and he did that. I was pleased with that because he liked the idea that was the way to open it, is go with those seats turning and the fans going, and all this stuff. And I also suggested that to at least account for the fact that there was gravity on board the ship, which there couldn't possibly be because the ship wasn't rotating or anything. But I said, if we imagine there's some sort of imaginary mechanical gravity, you could, which is really problematic, but say if there was some way in which the ship had some sort of a very advanced physics that would pin everyone to the floors as though there were gravity. But I thought, it would work in the storytelling. It doesn't get in the way, and it also kind of suggests that there's some magical kind of gravity effect they have, and they aren't just walking around, because when you consider the profound impossibility of that. I think because I'm an avid sort of popular science reader. In other words, a lot of accessible writing in science changes from time to time. Sometimes there's a lot of it around, and right now it's kind of a golden era for accessible science writing. And I became kind of very well read on physical anthropology and astronautics and genetics and biology, and fascinated by all those things. And as soon as I got in a position to read a script, especially if it was a sci-fi script, I was kind of appalled at how little was known about what we already know, that wasn't even in the script. And so I would say, well, let's bring it up to date first, and then we can speculate on what's happening. So I would be very annoyed at people who didn't understand or couldn't depict realistically a whole bunch of technical things they were making up that were kind of insulting to a significant mass of the audience out there who probably knew more than the writer about a lot of the things he's trying to talk about. So I got instantly irked and became very argumentative and persuasive about how this will have a much wider appeal if it's more believable. So these things are popping into my head all the time, not nitpicking to say let's make it accurate, but just what was really known was much more interesting, and it would work theatrically far better to tell the story. Like saying that you've got to remember you're in a pressurized spacecraft in a vacuum, and that's jeopardy right there. And most people would just forget that. So, but if you have a way of showing that you're in a vacuum and that it's really hostile outside, that helps theatrically. And then I also argued for, if you had this alien creature on board the Nostromo, clearly all anyone had to do is just put on their spacesuits and evacuate all the air out of the Nostromo, and you'd kill the alien. And because I doubt if any creature could live in a vacuum, you know. And that's pretty much what happens. The creature can't live in a vacuum; it's sent into the vacuum. But then I said, well, but why wouldn't they do that? And I made a big, it's one of the things I argued about. And he said, well, I've got an idea. What if its blood is so acidic that if they kill the creature on board the ship, it would immediately decompose and burn giant holes through the ship and disable your ship? So you've got to lure it off the ship while it's alive, and not have it, so the creature can't die on board the Nostromo, because it'll destroy the Nostromo as a dead body. And the integrity of the script of the story is still of paramount importance. You're not just sitting there putting roadblocks in the movie just to make it real. I'm always looking for things that both make it more acceptable and real, but also enhance the storyline and actually enhance the jeopardy and enhance everything and give people more to think about. I had a kind of a nice intro into a very big budget film, and to the extent that we all were kind of discovered by the fans and outed, as to who did this, who did that. The fan interest was growing. Michael Seymour was the production designer, but it used to be you'd only hear about him. But now the fans were atomizing the cast, the crew list, and finding out who did what. So we all got reasonable credit, certainly Giger, and a whole new era was starting, and I was very much typecast in for that. And that set me up for Cameron to call me out of the blue and say, we want you to do the sequel too. We want you to do Aliens. Aliens, still though, it wasn't the same crew, wasn't the same people, and a lot more action, and right away he wanted me to do the drop ship and the Acheron, the colony, and the big atmosphere processor, which I started doing sketches and drawings of, but the drop ship I kind of homed in on and worked very closely with Cameron on giving it a kind of a Vietnam look. He wanted a kind of a Vietnam helicopter look for the drop ship, and the APC, the tank that came out. I had one version that was very wedge shaped, but it turned out that we couldn't afford to build a full-size one with that kind of a wedge. It was just going to be too difficult. So we got an airline tug from Heathrow and built that into the tank, with the great big wheels. And then finally built those sets with a full-size drop ship in the set. It was a full-size mock-up of the thing, and that was fabulous. That was just fabulous to see all that. I was there for the beginning of the shooting, and oh, gee, there was so many things to do. The pulse guns, I had to design the pulse guns and make them, ones with the automated guns, and had to make them out of motorcycle parts and pieces of other guns and all this. One of the great ideas that Cameron had was the Steadicam mount for a machine gun, using a Steadicam mount so the machine gun would float next to the soldier. Cameron was very interested in having a lot of mystique of Vietnam kind of transferred into the movie. So we took the Colonial Marines and got all the actors all dressed up in the costumes and everything. And Cameron and I sat in this room and had them come in one by one, and with felt tips we added graffiti on their on their uniforms, Apocalypse Now and all these kind of things, and funny little cartoons and all that. That's Cameron. It was just great. All these little details are perfect. So they had rude remarks on them. You hardly ever see them in the film, but it was all sort of in keeping with that defiance. And when we finally got the tank put together, we had to take out tons of lead from the tug, the airline tug, because that's how it gets traction to pull an airline. But now you didn't need it, so Cameron couldn't resist. He took it out on the back lot and stomped it. Stomped the accelerator, and the thing was so much lighter, and the engines were so powerful, the thing practically flew. It just ripped up a whole piece of ground, threw dirt in the air, and started rocketing across this back field and almost through a building. And Cameron spent, he's a typical Valley kid from L.A., and so he couldn't resist. He just went there and did wheelies and ripped up the ground and everything, and because it was just such a bizarre vehicle, and it was so powerful. We had to, everyone then knew not to push. We had to really regulate the throttle, because you did that took off in the middle of a set. It would be the end of about 6 people. I think maybe it was Dan who introduced me to John Whitney and Gary Demos, who had a little company called Triple I, and they were eventually going to become Digital Productions, where we did Last Starfighter. And they had already started to do rendered 3D models, and very early. And they had a very well-known icon of a man, they dressed in a tuxedo, juggling Aristotelian solids, like this, but photoreal, with a cap on and looking around. And when I saw that, I hit the floor. I said, this is the future. This is it. This is fantastic, because the camera could move around the figure and he would juggle. And so later I insisted on joining his company. And I was the creative director for Digital Productions later on. So I designed all the instrumentation for the Nostromo that would appear on the screens, and I had in mind, much as Kubrick and Clark did in 2001, where they faked the vector model of the antenna, when Hal was showing them. That was hand animated. That wasn't really even done in a computer, but it was anticipating that computers could do that. That's when I was so aware of this coming technology that bang, I bought a personal computer as quickly as I could, and bang, I said there was something called Zebra that was going to become Photoshop. I had a chance through friends to beta test and started, and I did some of the early, I used it to do artwork with great big pixels on the little fire plug, Mac, and wrote it right on up until I could do anything with Photoshop. So it was a pretty smooth transition into it there. But boy, I knew that was the absolute future. Yeah, I was asked by Steven Spielberg one day, that Zemeckis had this comic film he was doing about time travel, and he said he'd like me to read the script and maybe help out. And so I read Back to the Future, and I thought it was very funny that the time machine was made out of a DeLorean because of the stainless steel body. And so they went on with that, and so Steven said, well, could you do the DeLorean for us? So I said, fine, I'd be glad to, And I said, how do you make a, but as usual, things popped in my head, and I figured, well, I'll put this grid work around the thing is to create a field, a kind of an electric field, but it wasn't, and a nuclear reactor or something in the back. But so I started getting pictures of DeLoreans and drawing it up, and they said, well, look, we also we need some DeLoreans here to get going, because we're definitely going to go to the DeLorean. And he says, could you go? We don't have, there's no one available right now. Could you go out and buy us 7 DeLoreans that we need to chop up for the movie? And Steven asked me to do it, so I said, oh, well, fine. He says, yeah, well, you'll be able to, make sure they're in good shape and all. And so fine. So I got driven over to this garage in Glendale, California, where this guy, I don't know why or how, he collected 50 or 60 DeLoreans. He had a giant warehouse full of them. And he said, we would like to buy 7 over at Warner Brothers. We need 7 DeLoreans. So he says, well, certainly, go right ahead. So I wandered up and down the rows of DeLoreans and looking at them. I said, well, take that one and that one, those 2 over there, and how about this one, and throw that one in. Could I get that one half price? I don't know. And And he just wrote it all up, and I came back, and sure enough, they're all trucked over, and then and then I had to really work in earnest as to what we were going to do to them, and so I did drawings inside and out of how the control panels would look, and I figured that I should that again in true reverence for the script, that it was supposed to be Dr. Brown. It wasn't like NASA. So everything I thought should look very bolted on, that you'd buy from a electronics store, Radio Shack as they have in the States, and so I did all the some sort of familiar components of microphones and wires and plugs and all this stuff, and everybody was very pleased. They liked it, and we could never agree where the flux capacitor should go or what it should look like. So I did 2 or 3 designs for that. I couldn't tell you how the time machine worked. I wish I could, but I knew I could make it look believable. That's what you want to do. Like there was something going on here that maybe no one had thought of before. That's about the best you can do. But I did suggest that once it time travels, it should come back covered with ice, like it goes through some absolute zero realm, and at that point, and frost is running up the glass as they're there, and then back, and sure enough, the first time they send the dog and it comes back, Dr. Brown, they had it all covered with ice, So by and large, I ended up, it's pretty much the way I designed it from the beginning. So such is film. I was brought in as a concept designer, is what Cameron preferred to call me, which meant that I was comparable to a production designer, but he wanted to jump it up from concept artist because he did want me to really design the core of the thing, a deep core, the underwater drilling rig, and all the submarines and the scuba gear and the liquid breathing suit and all that. So I had to hit the books a little bit for that and catch up on what I did know about deep sea diving and all. And Cameron and I were just like that about believability. So it was a tremendous amount of running around the country and up into Canada and talking to deep sea divers and all these submersibles and things to incorporate them into the movie. And so the research was a starting point. Again, the research about undersea survival techniques and exploration is now. The movie's supposed to be about the future, so you've got to add that element of speculation of where it will go, what this would probably lead to, whether you're right or wrong. It has to be likely, and so you're always taking everything and then kind of advancing it into the future, or taking it one step here, one step there, or blending this with this to come up with an interesting hypothesis or an interesting methodology that has really interesting jargon that most people even specialize in those fields could almost believe, And I liked the whole thing of the liquid breathing suit. That was dramatic. You're right, that it's got to fit Ed Harris. What you're trying to do is pull off the effect, and you want the suit to be believable as to, that it's pushing liquids around rather than gases. So I just opted for this big backpack with all this plumbing on the front, with these rather thick pipes and things going into the helmet. And pretty much the first design I did on that, Cameron approved. He said that was it. That was the one to do. And then I supervised the building of the suit with a guy that built it in Burbank somewhere. And we only changed a couple things, but it really worked. And it was a great trick because when they filled the liquid up, and Ed Harris was really in there, as the liquid filled his helmet and up over his head, and then he had to pretend to be inhaling it and say, "Hey, everything's fine," when really he couldn't breathe and he was underwater, and he just had to act like he was okay. And then later, as I understand, they just tinted the thing amber. That's why they had the liquid amber. It's not necessarily amber. This liquid does exist. It does. You can breathe this liquid, but we weren't going to do it on the movie. It's too dangerous. So then they just tinted his helmet. So when he's underwater, he's got air in there and he's okay, but it looks like he's under that amber liquid. But as soon as you moved into a close-up, you could tell. So they would have to flood his amber tinted helmet with water, close the helmet when he's in there underwater in a helmet full of water. that's tinted so you could see his hair move like he was underwater, so it looked real. But then as soon as he couldn't hold his breath any longer, they would open the thing up to the tank where he still couldn't breathe, and they'd give him a mouthpiece. And occasionally they got there late, or a little bit late. And I know Ed Harris got really testy about practically drowned. I know a couple other instances where he felt very abused, but Cameron was doing everything to make it as real as possible, and it all worked. It worked really well, I thought. I think it's just a matter of keeping up with where the human species is understanding or uncovering things, knowing when it's dicey and knowing when it's not, when it's pretty well established, and then still using that as a jump-off point. Because also the history of science tells you a lot about the nature of breakthroughs and how you can almost always project in a linear way forward into the future depending on what's happening at a given time. But that's always wrong, because a breakthrough will occur that will turn everything, and you can't see that turn. So you think everything's just going to get more and more of this, less and less and less of that into the future. But suddenly two factors come together and they change everything. And the history of science is full of that. So if you're too academic and you just take stuff straight across as a given, which too many people do, I think then you don't join into the search. We should all be amateur scientists, I think, and be able to form interesting hypotheses that other people might want to test, I'm very much into the concepts and the content of the films I work on, and that's why if I don't kind of really find it exciting to recreate something that I think is wonderfully fantastic and to bring it to an audience, I'm a little bored, and so I like the challenge of taking people on that incredible idea of the deep ocean. And I've always been fascinated by the deep ocean with its component of darkness, which is rarely portrayed in film. Another thing where the realism is sort of set aside for the sake of optimum lighting, so you can see everything. But it's so much more interesting to depict the deep ocean with no light whatsoever except the light of their torches and things. And it's obviously more interesting theatrically, in a film. Yet it's been avoided for so long. What most people consider kind of unimportant things, I rankle a little bit when, as I say, when I think there's a little bit too much nonsense, or there's something not quite put over in the story that could be a lot more powerful if the language was different, if something was said in a slightly different way. And sometimes I find that upsetting, because I'm almost always right about that when the movie's actually made. It is a weak point in the movie that, I lost that battle, I would say. I think the most eroding, difficult emotion that you have in working in film is disappointment. Not being able to, especially if you're on board and you're very enthusiastic about making this particular picture, and you're really very excited about how it reads and how it seems to be coming together, and then there's something that the budget won't allow or can't be reshot or something like that, and maybe something you thought would just be enormously effective on the screen, and now it's going to be an embarrassment. That's really hard to take. You're really, it's so disappointing, and you just can't set the clock back, and you can't get the extra money. And boy, especially if you are directing, I think that's you really got to be inured against disappointment, because inevitably you have to compromise in some way that just is not there's no aesthetic solution, I'm a big fan of the human species. I'm always rooting for human beings, and I'm always thinking that there's something to be said for the whole spectrum of our behavior, from the darkest to the lightest. And there are reasons for it all, and it's interesting to probe those or expose them a little bit and see different sides of different issues. And I think every good story, I think, deals with that dilemma, you know, who are we and why do we do what we do? But it comes across the screen in that we resonate, we feel compassion, or we feel confused, or we feel puzzled by something but want to solve it, you know. I kind of liken it to the idea of exploration, of you explore life, and the highest form of exploring life is science, where we really come up with repeatable insights and true understandings. It's all storytelling to me. It's all script. I always kind of feel the director, if I'm acting as director, both director and designer, should be paying a lot of attention to the script, because if it's a good script, it's going to have a lot of hidden things you don't quite realize are there until you start designing it and realize, oh, that I see how that works. You know, it works story-wise. And I'm always, as I said, gravitating to the needs of the script. And I'll be out there reminding the director, we've got to, you know, this is set up, and we've got to develop that, and this is why we want this color on the set. You know, it suggests, it's a subliminal suggestion of depression or lifelessness or jeopardy, whatever. I guess when it comes right down to it, is a powerful but difficult to define integration of all the elements, so that it functions as a whole, as a kind of alternate reality, but it smells real, even though we all know it isn't, and maybe even the audience, at the back of their mind, they know it is not real. They still have a sense, they'll go along with it as a kind of a style. We always are won over by the idea of a movie that suddenly depicts a submarine in the Second World War a great deal more realistically than it had been before. And you say, Das Boot's really good. That's probably much more the way it really looked. And the idea there is you're incorporating a lot of realities that were left out, that it stinks, that the lighting is poor, it's really cramped, and it's uncomfortable and all. The thing I find most exciting is when an audience said, now I know what it's really like. You know, now I believe that the 18th century really looked this way. You know, that's really how a street scene really looked, with all the garbage in the street and all that. And that to me is very thrilling, because it turns movies into time machines. And inasmuch as we're all hooked on naturalism anyhow, I think it's not a bad style. I know there's a whole school of thought that, you know, that we have the opportunity to play with time and play with stylized realities and inner realities and dreamlike realities, and I think that's all wonderful too. But I do like the idea of where, you know, people saw 2001, said, now I know what it's like to be in space. You know, the only thing I'm a little fearful of is that things of the imagination can be made to look real. And I'd actually prefer to see the techniques used to enhance the real, to match the real in film, at least in certain kinds of film. I'm always a little worried about fantasy, because we begin to want, in a kind of infantile way, to see the world as we wish it were. And I don't particularly think we should enforce that, because the world as it is so astounding, and to ignore, which we do, ignore how astounding the real world is in favor of kind of escapist fantasy, bothers me a bit, you know. I'd rather impress people by reality. I think, gee, it's almost daily I see the stuff being perfected. Now, what people will think of, or what they can do, and on and on and on, I still think is, you know, remains to be seen. There's just no limit. And I would say we'd probably all be astounded if we could see where all this technology is in 10 years. We'll be absolutely astounded, no matter how much we think we wouldn't be. I would say that I don't particularly have a worldview. I have an approach, which is always to be open to new things, and always to
understand something you didn't understand before, and always to learn something or get an idea from someone else that I would never have arrived at.
I really want to have to emphasize I'm not at all interested in nitpicking or accuracy for the sake of accuracy. It's just that it's a shame to waste so much that we already know. We've been in space, for instance, for 50 years, and most films that depict space flight still resort to the aircraft model, just sitting around, walking on the floor plates and flying like in an airliner with the engines on all the time and with the nose pointed in the direction you're going, like you're plowing through a sea of gas, when you're in an absolute vacuum, and the spacecraft are all upright, and it just irritates the hell out of me. Well, we're not allowing audiences to experience what it's really like, because it's the sense of otherness, I think, is really fascinating to me, and I like to introduce it into everything I work on. One of the more enjoyable things that I've always been very privileged to be able to talk about and think about is that I had a sort of a science fictional childhood. I grew up with the discovery of fantastic stories and probably first comics or newspaper comics, and then from Flash Gordon on to a realization that there is something to the idea of looking into the future. We move so fast through time, and things change, increasingly change, that we really must be more wary of where we're going than where we've been. So there's always been an interesting curiosity, a receptivity on the part of the public to see where we're going, to have stories that tell that. And I think right now it's really coming into its own. It's a very, very interesting transformation of how mythologies work. Right now, we don't need myths about the past. We need mythologies about the future.